This is Lecture 122A, The Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin to Bern, Switzerland. The betrayal of the German workers by their Social Democrat leaders and immediate subsequent betrayal of the workers of the other capitalist countries of Europe was a shock to Vladimir Lenin. For many years, the Social Democrats had sworn that when the inevitable imperialist war was kicked off by the capitalists, that they would rise, leading the workers of the world to turn the imperialist war into a civil war. In the event, they had done the opposite. Lenin traveled the 79 miles from Geneva to Berlin in September 1914 to use that library in his restudy of Hegel and the history leading to the World War. As I said in Volume 1 of this series, the fact that he had to do it this way shows me a lot. It says that his contact with the masses was not what it might have been, or he would have anticipated this and been prepared for it. As soon as he reached Bern, Lenin headed for the excellent library to restudy Hegel, especially his book Science of Logic. For an entire year, Lenin studied Hegel. His slogan, "Turn the imperialist war into a civil war," became the political great divide in Marxism, and his abstract of Hegel's logic became the philosophic foundation of Leninism. From this comprehension of the mechanics of dialectical materialism applied to the science of history, Lenin produced Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and his book Stated Revolution, both on the eve of the 1917 Great October Socialist Revolution. Now I shall begin our study of the Bolshevik Revolution of 22 to 24 October 1917, that is November in Switzerland, with the review of what we covered in lecture number 1, because this is what Lenin came away with in 1915, as shown in his abstract of Hegel's logic. The Marxist philosophy of science, Epistemology. Friedrich Engels spent the better part of his life studying the then contemporary advance of philosophy as the highest guiding body of knowledge of any science. His central conclusion was science and philosophy had become the same thing, at least as far as we are concerned. Bourgeois ideologists, of course, are paid for penning ongoing bullshit, but that is their problem. There are no better works on dialectical materialist epistemology than the originals of this great historical genius, and from his work we have constructed the modern materialist philosophy of science. Marxist philosophy students should go back and start at the beginning with the work of Friedrich Engels. Now, our method flows from the Marxist philosophy of science and the theoretical explanations thereby constructed. Science always has an explanatory and investigative structure, beginning with epistemology, which is what the branch of philosophy known as theory of knowledge is called. In our case, it is the epistemology of dialectical materialism, and I like to summarize the epistemology of dialectical materialism in 9 points. 1. There are no supernatural phenomena. The universe is real and exists independent of human consciousness. 2. Human consciousness is the property of matter organized in a special way. 3. All things are directly or indirectly connected. 4. For change to happen, there must be direct physical connection between those things. This is cause and effect. And 5. There are 2 kinds of causes. The primary cause, which is internal to any given phenomenon, and the secondary cause, which conditions the primary cause and is external to the primary cause. The interaction of the primary and conditioning causes are what we call cause and effect. Cause and effect we call process. The study of causality and process is dialectics. Within any given phenomenon there are multiple aspects. The constant interaction of these aspects is the only constant in philosophy, the constant of motion or change. The development of change in a given phenomenon features a certain aspect X as dominant. It is inevitable that change will bring a previously minor aspect Y into the dominant position. It is the study of how Y becomes X, or how opposites interact, Y negating X. Then that negation itself must inevitably be negated again, repeatedly. That is the essence of dialectical process. 9. The process of change always occurs as a product of quantitative changes. These quantitative changes eventually bring about a qualitative change. The classical example is the quantitative one-by-one caloric introduction of heat to ice that changes ice qualitatively to water. Additional identical caloric additions change the water to vapor. Heat itself is simply a measurement of molecular motion. Now, on the structure of science. Schematically, we can picture the following from top to bottom. The first level on top is epistemology. Below epistemology is general theory, which means a series of statements and concepts expressed in words or numbers or both, explaining everything within that science. At the next level, below general theory, each science has many seemingly innumerable specific theories, which are more specific statements that explain everything within a rather tightly subsumed category within that science. So, for example, we have the general theory of historical materialism and the specific theory of primitive communism. The latter specific theory is examined in Appendix A of this book, and the former general theory is the subject matter and practical exposition of this entire volume. In our case, our general theory is historical materialism, what this book is all about. And that also means our general theory is the highest theory of the sciences of anthropology, psychology, history, and sociology. When we set our immediate task to develop a specific explanation or theory that covers all examples of the new class and all circumstances where it exists, we turn to the three major ways to construct an explanatory, specific scientific theory. These are 1. The deductive way, where the premises make the conclusion necessary. 2. The probabilistic form of theoretical explanation, where the premises make the conclusion probable. And 3. The historical or genetic form, where any given event is explained in terms of its evolutionary antecedent forms. Because genetic has so many other connotations in science, we will use the term historical, which at any rate has its own place in the history of our science. Cross-cultural comparative analysis, mathematics of social evolution. To use the third form of scientific investigation explanation, we can extract a formula for production as the theoretical way of expressing the relationship within the mode of production. The mode of production is also called the base of culture, and ideology arises on the base and is called the superstructure. And so the base itself, or is called the mode of production, and it has two components, technology and social organization. The formula can be expressed in terms of 4 elements in an equation using the formula for the capitalist stage as an example, and you can take a look at Volume 1, Chapter 9 for that. Now these are human working activities, where L equals concrete individual working activity, LP equals homogenized collective labor, temporally measured, called labor power. Technology, in the case of capitalism, this is always some kind of machinofacture. Value, the cost of labor, and in the servitude epoch, especially in the capitalist stage, the cost of labor power. And then surplus value, the additional amount produced above value in capitalist systems and in pre-capitalist systems of the servitude epoch. In the equation, we substitute surplus social product for surplus value in pre-servitude epoch times, that is, in primitive communist and chiefdom societal stages. The relationship of these factors is expressed as followed, and then I put down the formula L or LP plus technology gives V1, V2 plus SV. These are the 4 essential elements of human productive activity, and they can be cross-culturally compared through time and across the entire space of the globe. This is the way we build our theory in social science and the way we make it usable. You may think of these factors as analogous to the 4 nucleotides of socio-cultural DNA. Not that there is such a thing, of course. Now, the general theoretical structure is the cultural concept of the mode of production and its superstructure. The specific theoretical constructs are as numerous as the socio-cultural evolutionary stages they represent, which is to say, 1. We define the essential elements at the core of something, in this case human productive activity, and 2, arrange them in such a way that they appropriately describe every instance of the subject in question. In this case, it is the evolution of human productive activity through distinct stages, and 3, we do this at 2 levels, A high general level, and B, a secondary tier of specific levels. As you can see, theory has 2 magnitudes. Now we can take an example of the new class, the collapse of the USSR and Eastern Europe. In this book, we rely on all 3 forms of scientific explanation. The main theme, however, is the third, historical form of scientific investigation and explanation, and accordingly, when we get to the subject of what happened in Russia after 1953, leading to the great traitor Gorbachev and the collapse of the USSR, we shall first examine the origin and development of our contemporary new class and trace its development from previous forms. In doing so, we will see that the new class has had several occupational or professional components. Accounting is one, enforcement is another, religion and certain associated scientific endeavors such as astronomy is another, professionally specialized crafts are another. The point is for you to understand who the predecessors of today's new class were, how they functioned and transformed stage by stage as society evolved from primitive communism. Mechanically, the embryo of the Russian new class was in the USSR, Volume 1, Chapter 12. After the 1953 death of Stalin, second economy privateers suborned the Soviet new class. They prepared the way for a good coup d'etat by the Russian mafia and the CIA. It was the latter who engineered the actual assault from 1985 to 1991 on the Soviet government and its leaders, replacing them with their own men led by Gorbachev and Yeltsin. In this now six-volume textbook, we have what we meant to have when we used the phrase, quote, a Marxist theoretical explanation, unquote, for what we are in our historical evolutionary past. Before this book, it was the Euro-American left's failure to produce a Marxist theoretical explanation for what happened in the USSR and Eastern Europe that left them in limbo. I have provided that explanation in this handbook. As bad as their failure in understanding capitalist restoration in the Soviet Union was, even worse was their failure to provide a theoretical understanding of how the Communist Party of China developed the final solution in its practical program. As the October 1917 19th Chinese Communist Party Congress unfolded, it became clear to communists worldwide that the contemporary People's Republic of China has become the new homeland of the global socialist stage and the hope of the world. China has succeeded in advancing toward communism by perfecting the Stalinist socialist stage and is moving forward in an advanced socialist stage. As you read and study this book from page 1, you will understand what has happened and what is to be done. This 6-volume textbook provides the knowledge for North American communists to organize the final proletarian revolution, and next year it's going to have a 7th and possibly 8th volume added to it. Evolution of culture, the dialectics of contradiction and crises. Mechanical materialists, for example, Leslie White and Marvin Harris, approach the evolution of culture as a linear process whereby one step leads to the next. Dialectical materialists approach the evolution of culture by deciphering how one type of core causal phenomena transforms into its opposite step by step from the earliest to the most recent, and then we try to project into the future the likely next dialectical resolution. This is what Lenin took from his year-long Bern library study of Hegel. Rather than continue to speak in the abstract, let us see how this method works in practice. The general contradiction can be reduced to a prime directive for our purposes. There are 2 general contradictions with which we are preoccupied in our studies, and each of these will have its own prime directive. The philosophical general contradiction describes the 2 opposite poles in the social organizational component of any society. Recognizing these opposite poles is the first step and the key to understanding the social organization of an epoch. The interaction of these opposite poles is the theoretical engine driving change and in maintaining the status quo. In practice, there is the prime directive that resolves the interaction of the opposite poles and is the resulting cultural commandment for all citizens of the group in question in the epoch being studied. Let us turn to the real world to exemplify what I've just said. General contradiction of primitive communism. In our case, we begin by describing two general contradictions that occupy two epochs in human history. The first of these is the general contradiction of the first egalitarian epoch, that is, the epoch of primitive communism, consisting of the bands and tribes of the hunting, gathering, and early agricultural modes of production. Simply put, it is that every step taken to prevent surplus social product and the social dissolution inevitably created by it becomes, in addition, a step in making the creation of surplus social product a certainty. And as importantly, this fact makes it certain that even though a given step may gain a temporary respite in the burgeoning of surplus social product, the process is even more certain to end in social dissolution. The prime directive of this general contradiction is to avoid the production of surplus social product at virtually any cost. Now we come to the general contradiction of the servitude epoch. The second general contradiction is that of the servitude epoch, the stages of slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. Here, quote, every step taken is aimed at maximizing production, but despite this, the results are less and less of a share for those doing the work. In fact, the result is a worse living condition for the producers themselves. In turn, this fact of super-exploitation makes it certain that the dissolution of this epoch will also occur as slaves, serfs, and workers revolt. This contradiction sharpens the class struggle, requiring the rulers' use of the armed force, that is, the state, in their exclusive hands. The domesticating classes can only pacify the masses who are resisting the process of being domesticated with increasingly brutal violence. The prime directive of this general contradiction is to maximize production regardless of all other factors. The central theoretical task confronting us Bolsheviks is to explain how the first contradiction transformed into the second opposite contradiction. Now we want to come to the evolution of culture in terms of crises dialectics. A general crisis, on the other hand, is the engine that drives a particular stage within the epochs through growth, maturation, and eventual dissolution. For example, in the slave stage, as part of the second or servitude epoch with its specific general contradiction, the general crisis arises as a result of the need to have a larger and larger, ever-growing army and police, that is, the state itself, in other words, and this is needed to keep the slaves in servitude. The cost of the state, or army and police, is a drawdown, or cost, charged against the surplus value column. Furthermore, and in addition, it is the difficulty in quantifying the cost of the generals, or sergeants, eventually realizing they can replace their employers. A more intangible cost mathematically, but very real objectively. Both A, the drawdown on surplus value, and B, the rise of the state, that is the army and police, over society, lead to the end of slavery as a stage. In turn, arises the necessity of the halfway house of feudalism to replace it. This half-measure stage can be expressed in the form of a quadratic equation. Simply put, I mean that one half of the equation is that showing the locus of the general crisis of slavery, the other half showing the locus of the general crisis of capitalism. Note that this resolution of the transformation of primitive communism to chattel and then wage slavery must also be viewed dialectically. The transformation from the stateless society of primitive communism to state society began, matured, and came to conclusion in the chiefdom stages. The state arose to ensure the status quo of wealth and inequality. Yet the very success of the state in freezing this otherwise irreconcilable contradiction, doomed that status quo. Why? Because it necessitated the working class of capitalism taking power into their own hands with their own state apparatus as the only certain way to end the state, the principal weapon of class domination. Of course, ending the state does not mean ending armed force in the hands of the people, no more than it meant primitive communism had no use for armed force. The state properly defined means only the armed force in the exclusive hands of a ruling class. Armed force existed before the Servitude epoch, and it will exist after that epoch. At any rate, we just introduced you to the equation for the stage of chattel slavery. What about the equation for the stage of wage slavery, or capitalism? In capitalism, the general crisis is caused by the financial cost to the capitalist of the constantly increasing investment required of him to stay competitive. He must buy into increasingly expensive next generations of machinery, which is a drawdown on the surplus value column. Eventually, as you will see, one capitalist eats the other, and capital is concentrated. This also can be expressed in the form of an equation. In short, we say that it is the law of the absolute decline in the rate of profit that results from this inherent need of each capitalist to stay competitive by buying into increasingly new machinery. This is the engine both causing and driving the general crisis of capitalism. The resolution should be viewed dialectically in that investment in the next generation of machinery, abbreviated MGM in the equation, occurs to increase production and to increase its efficiency, yet the ultimate outcome is great poverty for the mass of producers. Consequently, workers must revolt to put an end to the steady deterioration of their lives. If they are to cease getting less and less value for themselves, even though they produce more and more value overall, they must end expropriation by the capitalist. This expropriation by the capitalist is why we say the capitalist at bottom is just a legalized system of theft. In other words, the industrial capitalists as a class are criminals, smarter than drug traffickers and bank robbers in being the core of the cap class system. As communists, we have to deal with the world as it is. This means in all of our work we will be engaging with criminal classes. Whether that is good or bad depends on our success in the ongoing struggle or lack thereof. To recap the principal lesson of this section, remember that human culture and societal affairs can be reduced to the few simple elements mentioned above and in detail below, in the same way that all life on Earth can be reduced to a few simple nucleotides. This is what science is all about, that is, getting to the core of causality and process, and laying bare the key driving elements, stripping away all the non-essential factors, adornments, and related manifestations. Do not get confused. Violence, armed force, government, class, and state. I want you to notice that we Marxists do not confuse the state with violence. Violence existed before class and state society and will continue after class and state society. Neither do we confuse the state with armed force, for armed force of the people as a whole existed before the emergence of class and state societies and will exist after the disappearance of class and state society. We do not confuse the state with government, for people governed themselves before class and state society and their governments, and they shall govern themselves after the disappearance of class and state society of the Servitude epoch, that is, slavery, capitalism, and feudalism. The state refers to thuggery, that is, a private monopoly of armed force in the hands of an already separated, or in the process of separating, ruling class. Class refers to a group of people with a distinct relationship to the means of production, the most important relationship being that between those who own and those who do not own said means of production. In class-divided society, existing for only some 6,000 years, other classes exist as well, particularly classes composed of those who find employment serving ruling classes, such as soldiers, cops, and priests. There are also small proprietors and occasional entrepreneurial workers and in time a new class of technocrats. Absolute decline in the rate of profit. There is continuing confusion over the law of the absolute decline in the rate of profit. Marx found confusion abundant on this subject during his lifetime, and he had a great deal to say about this misunderstanding in the post-1867 period, that is, and the publication of Capital Volume 1, the period after that. Yet because macro-theoretical economics is such a rarely understood, let alone taught, science in the USA, most readers have no previous experience with the subject matter, and it is worth reframing the matter here. The crux of confusion lies in understanding the difference between the absolute decline in the rate of surplus value production and the absolute decline in the rate of profit. These are two separate categories, two separate things, yet intimately related all the same. You will become familiar with many equations which are shorthand ways of describing relations between essential elements of human productive activity. Let us jump ahead just for the moment, using the formula for the capitalist stage as the example. Labor power, LP, plus technology, or T, give value 1 plus value 2 plus surplus value, and that surplus value column is divided into two, profit and NGM. In the case of capitalism, we are always discussing the application of human labor power, that is, homogenized collective output of factory workers measured by the factory clock, applied to machinery. The category T stands for technology, which is machinery in the capitalist stage, and what is thereby produced repays the workers for their labor power, only in part, and therefore provides an insufficient amount to the reproduction of the working class itself, so workers will often be destined to an early death through starvation and lack of medical care, which is what we label as value 1, that is, wages and benefits, and this category also accounts for the factory installation and upkeep of the machinery, that is value 2. We call both value 1 and value 2 value. What is left over is what we call surplus value. From the surplus value column there are many possible deductions the capitalist can make, but the ones of greatest concern to us are those that account for, as subcolumns in our equation, the capitalist profit, and those that account for his investment in the next generation of machinery. When new machinery is installed under T, or technology, in our equation, it is done precisely to lower the amount of labor power, LP, that is required to produce a given commodity. This allows the capitalist to hire fewer workers. Or another way of putting it is that workers previously hired will be sent to the street unemployed. The rate of surplus value production must decline because to buy the new machinery, install and maintain it, the capitalist must shift more overall output from surplus value to value 2. That is the cost of installing and maintaining the newly purchased machinery. And most importantly, he must take more of this overall output and shift it to cover the cost of this newly purchased next generation of machinery, or NGM. Now, the decline in the rate of surplus value creation. In order to avoid this reduction in the rate of surplus value formation, the capitalist would have had to hire more workers and or work the same workers longer hours so that labor power input increases at a 1-to-1 ratio with that of the increased productive power of the new machinery, thereby maintaining the same rate of surplus value creation. In this way, he would stay competitive. It is for this reason that capitalism as a stage hates competition, because this it cannot do. The capitalist idea was to reduce the amount of labor power going in, not to increase it, and thus his costs. Therefore, right off the bat, while the introduction of new machinery means a reduction in the cost of his labor force, that is, in hours and numbers of workers, it also means an increase in the cost of installing new machinery and maintaining newly equipped factories and therefore results in a reduced rate of surplus value being created, and because simultaneously the capitalist must invest more and more of his remaining overall output in the purchase of the new machinery. This means, all other things being equal, that this absolute decline in the rate of surplus value creation is exacerbated and indeed brought to crises by these new costs of each successive generation of machinery. Again, on the absolute decline in the rate of profit. This latter fact always means an absolute decline in the rate of profit. This is why, as Karl Marx discovered, it is the antagonistic articulation of profit with the cost of the next generation of machinery under surplus value, which is the locus of the general crisis of capitalism. That is what causes the business cycle of boom and bust. Of course, there are short-term things a capitalist can do to offset the absolute decline, at least temporarily, by choosing new ways or eliminating previous ways of using his surplus value that had hitherto been choices he found desirable. The best long-term way for him is 1. Monopoly and or fixed corrupt contracting, and 2. Slave labor. However, both of these generate massive social resistance. No matter what he does, short of these two things, in the end, he is still confronted with the necessity of investing in new machinery or losing competitive advantage to other capitalists. In the end, he will have less surplus of value available for profit. This is the iron law of capitalist relations. In short, the decline in the rate of surplus value creation, as the cost of value 2 must increase even when labor costs, V1, decrease, as he sends workers to the street, sets the stage for a general crisis. Why? Because what surplus value is available must be shifted on an increasing scale to cover the cost of the next generation of machinery. Thus, in the end, there is less surplus value available for whatever other expenditures he may have in mind, especially profit. And this means that the rate of profit must also decline. That is why I said that while these two absolute declines in rate are totally separate categories, they are at the same time intimately related. I want you to read the chapter on capitalism, number 9, in volume 1, carefully for the detailed exposition. This summary may assist you in understanding what's going on. These technical data on the operation of the capitalist system are not just for economists. These internal operations of all capitalist systems always end up in terrible social and political crises that close factories, sending masses of workers to the street, left our higher priced commodities for consumers, and the undercutting all the social programs that workers have fought for, which can no longer be paid for in the black. You are witnessing the truth of all I have written above today in your everyday lives. A few more comments on laws. Before proceeding, I want to review some other definitions around which confusion often exists. That is the definition of the terms law of value, laws of history, laws of socio-cultural evolution. When we use the phrase laws of history, we should be referring to Marx and Engels' discovery of the fact that history is determined by people using culture. Culture in the anthropological definition is the buffer between the environment and society. This is the broadest stroke of the use of the term law. It refers to the fact that all human social and cultural evolution must be understood in terms of the evolution of culture's three components: technology, social organization, and ideology. The mode of production being the forces and relations of production, with ideology as the superstructure. These apply to all human socio-cultural formations. This is, as Engels said in his funeral eulogy to Karl Marx, one of the two greatest discoveries of Marx. Engels pointed to the other greatest accomplishment of Marx being the unlocking of the secrets of the internal operation of the capitalist stage. I think a third great accomplishment of Marx was his formulation of the Marxist theory of psychology. Here the relationships exhibited in production are known to appear in new and different forms. To paraphrase Marx in Volume 1 of Capital, quote, the material relations among people appear as social relations between things, unquote. On the other hand, the phrase law of value refers specifically to the law by which capitalism operates, not to pre-capitalist formations, except, of course, where capitalist germinal elements are present in pre-capitalist stages of the servitude epoch, and then the law of value operates only within the germinal capitalist sector. The law of value, in this sense, always refers to the, quote, socially necessary labor time, unquote, required in the production of a commodity. The relative value of a commodity produced by different factories is the socially necessary labor time involved in the production of a commodity in factory X as compared to factory Y. This is usually a function of the amount of new, advanced machinery installed in a given factory. The newer that machinery, the less socially necessary labor time is required in the production of a given commodity. Laws of socio-cultural evolution will be explained and has been explained as we have proceeded through these volumes, but again, these refer to all stages in some cases and only specific stages in others. Laws of history refer in general to all of the above. These are important considerations and not simply matters of technical definition. They are important because Marxists believe in history being determined by cause and processual interaction of these causes in a lawful manner, as in any other case of natural phenomena. Marx dealt primarily with the laws of operation of the capitalist stage and was spending the latter years of his life deciphering the laws by which pre-capitalist formations operate, a task he left uncompleted. Marx never made the mistake of projecting into the past capitalist formation laws onto pre-capitalist society. Even Soviet textbooks, originally at least supervised by Stalin, tended to blur these distinctions. It is important that we do not duplicate that error. Mao pointed this out in his A Critique of Soviet Economics, as seen in the 1977 Monthly Review Press edition of this important work of Mao Zedong. Finally, the key to understanding the economics of Stalinist socialism lies in its historical development in the 1920s and is fully explicated in Volume 1, Chapter 10. Now, just a quick comment on the first presentation of stage sequential laws of operation. It is fine to assert that such universal laws exist because, on the one hand, we know epistemologically and in our general theory that such laws must exist. It is quite another to assert that the laws of operation of pre-capitalist systems are known when in fact they are not. To the best of my knowledge, this series of volumes are the first to project a series of laws of specific operation of each stage of pre-capitalist society. This series conforms in every way to the model established by Marx in his analysis of capitalism and in Friedrich Engels in his books on science and philosophy. And one final word on the future. For Marxists, there has always been one clear vision of the future. It was laid out for us by the founders of our science, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Their vision was and is a part of the science of society and culture and their history. That is to say, it is a product of and mandated by our scientific understanding of socio-cultural evolution. Virtually every subsequent great thinker in our tradition has identified with that vision, including V.I. Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping. So what precisely is that vision? The future mode of production for Marxists and Leninists features highly advanced industrial technology alongside social relations of absolute egalitarianism and the full freedom of each individual to the fullest expression of their innermost desires in daily productive activity, sexual orientation, and family life. Certainly not least, it is a vision of plenty of material goods for each and every person as a matter of birthright. In this regard, technology in the future we shall build is so advanced as to assure the production of unlimited quantities of heavy and light industrial goods and consumer articles. and the distribution of all such produce to every industry and to every person. The future, in other words, features society where unlimited access to the articles of production for every person is a simple fact of everyday life. In Russia, China, Eastern Europe, or Cuba, we have had to build the industrial base from scratch. Why? Because we did not inherit a fully developed capitalist mode of production. But all observers can see that we have built it and continue to do so. Bidding the state goodbye. For Marxists and Leninists, our goal is also a future society in which the state, that is the army and police, has ceased to exist and withered away. How can this instrument of class oppression be made to disappear? The answer is only by doing away with social classes first. Once we have done away with social classes, we have also done away with the role of the state in all societies. The role of the state is a role for a social institution that is nothing more than an institution of repressive violence in the hands of an exploiting ruling class. Once class society ceases to exist, and class society did not exist for 99.99% of human history, nor did the state, then the need for the state will be gone too. When the state is no longer needed as an instrument of class rule, then and only then can we finally abolish the state, and until that time one class or another will rule. And the way one class or the other rules is through the use of police, intelligence services, military force, judicial systems, torture chambers, prisons, and execution. There are no exceptions now, nor have there ever been any exceptions anywhere to this form of class rule, nor shall there ever be. In contemporary times, when the capitalists have state power in their hands, they use it against us. When we seize power, we establish our own state, and we use that power in new and loyal hands against them. Who will persevere? Science tells us that we will, but science cannot yet tell us how long it will take us to win, for better or for worse. In the meantime, before the final solution, we are free agents with free will. We are free to win, and we are free to lose. And that brings us to the conclusion of our first lecture on the Bolshevik Revolution. And next time we'll get down to the brass tacks of the seizure of power in Petrograd and across the Russian Empire.